So we've already talked about the square root method whenever we have something that doesn't have that middle term. But now we want to talk about factoring. So here's the thing about the real numbers. If I have something where a times b equals 0, what has to happen is either a is 0 or b is 0 or both. Doesn't matter. But if two numbers multiply to be 0, one of them was 0. And that's not true for anything else. So if I had like a times b equals 4, well, there are a bunch of different solutions to that. A could be 4 and b could be 1. They could both be 2, or maybe a is 1 and b is 4. Right? So there's many different options. That's not even all of them. I could have a is 8, b is 1/2, something like that. There's infinitely many of them. But if two numbers multiply to be 0, so if I have this special case up here, at least one of them was 0. And that's going to help us with factoring. If two things multiply to be 0, one of them was 0. So with factoring, what we want to do first is it must be set equal to 0. Put a little star here. It must be set equal to 0. Now I'm going to go through the steps over here, and then I'm going to do an example at the same time. I think that'll help us out. So the first example that I'm going to do is going to be 2x squared minus 3x minus 2 equals 0. This is already set to 0. I don't have to worry about moving anything to the left or right. It's already set equal to 0. So the first thing you're going to do is I'm going to multiply the x squared coefficient. Now what does that mean? That means the number in front of the x squared. So multiply the x squared coefficient with the constant coefficient. So what number is in front of the x squared over here? I'm going to write a little multiply, so a little x. I have a 2 in front of the x squared, and I have a negative 2 as the constant. So constant means there's no x attached to it. So I have a 2 and a negative 2, so I got a negative 4. So multiply your first and last term, get my negative 4. Secondly, you're going to write down the x coefficient. I'm going to put a plus beside that. So what number is in front of my x? Well, it's a negative 3. Okay, so we're good so far. So I multiplied the x squared coefficient with the constant coefficient, got my negative 4. Wrote down that middle term, or that middle coefficient, which was negative 3. Now you're going to solve the puzzle. So here's what I mean by solve the puzzle. Right here, I wrote down two things. I need two numbers that multiply to be negative 4, but add up to be negative 3. So think for a second. What numbers multiply to be negative 4 and add up to be negative 3? So maybe, and hopefully you got negative 4 and positive 1. Those multiply to be negative 4, add up to be negative 3. What we're going to do with those two numbers is split the middle term. So I come up here to my equation again. Instead of writing that negative 3x, I'm going to use these numbers. Negative 3x is the same as negative 4x plus 1x, or just x, doesn't matter. So again, instead of writing that middle term, use the numbers that you just thought of when you solved the puzzle and rewrite it. Step 5, we're going to group and factor. So when I say group, I mean this. Take your first two terms, group them, take your second two terms and group them. Look at those first two terms. What can I factor out of them? Well, definitely a 2 and also an x. So if I factor out a 2x, what do I get? Well, from the first time I get a leftover x, and then a minus 2 from the second one. Now look at my second two terms. What can I factor out? Well, nothing, so a 1. Okay, now what do you notice about these two terms I have? They both got an x minus 2 in them, so I'm going to write that down. In front of it, I'm going to write down the coefficients. So 2x squared minus 3x minus 2, exactly the same as 2x plus 1 times x minus 2. Exactly the same thing. All we did was rewrite it. Now why is that helpful to us? Well, think about what I said before. If two things multiply to be 0, one of them was 0. Well, here are my two things being multiplied to be 0, so one of them was 0. So that's step 6 here. Just set each equal to 0. If you solve for x on this first one, you get negative 1/2. Solve for x over here, you get 2. So what's my answer? Either x was negative 1/2 or x was 2. I'm going to do a couple more of these. Let's look at 3x squared plus 2x equals 8. Now we definitely can't use a square root method on this, and that's because I have this middle term, this 2x. As soon as you have that linear term, you can't use square root method. So I'm going to use factoring. Now what's the problem? It's not set equal to 0. You can't factor unless it's set equal to 0. That's an easy fix. Now it's set equal to 0. Alright, pretty good. So let's see. I'm going to solve this for factoring. Go ahead and fill in my stuff over here. Multiply my x squared term, or my coefficient for my x squared, and my constant term. So that's my first and last. And I get negative 24. Write down my x term, and I get that. So let's see. Give me two numbers that multiply to be negative 24 and add up to be 2. So if you said positive 6 and negative 4, I believe you are correct. Those multiply to be negative 24, add up to be 2. So what am I going to do with those two numbers? I'm going to rewrite that middle term using the numbers that we just came up with. So instead of a 2x, I'm going to say plus 6x minus 4x. Good. Next, group my terms. Look at my first two. What can I take out? I think a 3 and an x. So again, pause this. I'm going to quickly just to make sure you get it. Take out a 3x, you'll get x plus 2. Now look at my next two terms. What can I take out? Well, since there's a negative here, I'm going to take out a negative 4. And I'll get an x plus 2. Now why is that a plus 2 and not a minus 2? Because I factored out the negative. I factored out the negative and the 4, so that became an x plus 2. Now I got that term repeating, so I'm going to write it down. Then I'm going to write down the coefficients in front of it. So there's my 3x minus 4 and x plus 2. And then lastly, set each one equal to 0. From the first term, I get 4/3. From the second one, get a minus 2. So those are my answers. Example 3. Let's do 4x squared minus 2x minus 2 equals 0. Now I want to factor this. Sorry I said equal to 0, but I want you to notice something before we start factoring. Is there a number that I could just take out of the entire thing? So could I make this equation easier by just taking out a number? And I think the answer there is yes. Everything has a factor of 2 in it. You see that, how you take out a 2? Now what happens if I divide both sides by 2? I get this way easier equation. Well, I shouldn't say way easier, but it is definitely an easier equation by factoring out that 2 and dividing. Same equation, just simplified. Okay, now that we've simplified it a little bit, let's try to factor. So I need to multiply the first and last, write down my middle one. So I need two numbers that multiply to be negative 2, add up to be negative 1. So I got negative 2 and positive 1. So take those two numbers, rewrite that middle term. So instead of a negative x, I got a negative 2x and a positive 1x from that. Group and factor out. So my first one, I think I get 2x times x minus 1. And then over here, Can't take anything out, so I just get an x minus 1. I had a repeating term, x minus 1, and then my coefficients. Lastly, set each one equal to 0, and I get x equals negative 1/2 and x equals 1. So those are my two. Those are going to be my two solutions to these. So remember with factoring, get it set equal to 0, figure out what you need to multiply and add to, find those two numbers, and then try to factor out.